The Integration of Phase Negotiation Theory to the Fall of the House of Usher, an analysis of Group 3. Before we go deeper with the analysis or the integration of the theory to the story at hand, let us first have an introduction of the phase negotiation theory, which will be one of the focal points of our presentation. The aforementioned theory is a communication theory that was formulated by Stella Ting Toomey, a professor of human communication at California State University. This theory was devised in 1988 and was developed from the politeness research of Brown and Levinson and the research on phase of government. This theory is based on social psychological and social cultural traditions. As social beings, it is important for us to build relationships to the world. However, what comes with this are inevitable conflicts. This theory explains how cultural difference in people influence in managing conflicts and how it can be a part of maintaining a phase in the society. It is about how people work through their cultural and communicative obstacles in order to resolve a conflict based on mutual respect and communication competence. According to this theory, cultural, individual, and situational variables influence the selection of one set of phase concerns over another. Moreover, this theory also proposes that individualistic cultures prefer self-oriented phase work, while collectivistic cultures prefer self or other-oriented phase work, just like on how to support another's phase without harming your own phase. The theory also suggests that behavior is also influenced by cultural variances, individual, relational, and situational factors. The different types of individual and cultural identities and the projected image of oneself in relational situations are termed as the phases, and the social interaction by which two or more parties try to resolve a perceived incompatible goals as negotiation. Hence, it is called phase negotiation theory.
The phase has two sides, the positive and negative phase. The positive phase has the desire to be liked and admired by others, and the negative phase has the desire to be autonomous and free from others. Aside from that, the theory also introduced the terms phase need, which is the desire to be associated or disassociated with others, and phase concern, which is the interest of maintaining own self phase or someone's other phase. Communication does not take place in a vacuum, but it is influenced by the context and culture in which it takes place. One of the continuums is the cultural dimension, wherein in one side is the individualistic perspective, which is focused on the rights and concerns of each person, and in the other one is the collectivist perspective, which stresses the importance of the community. The other continuum is the context dimension. At one side is the low context culture, where meanings are obvious and direct, and on the other is high context culture, where one communicates in ways that are implicit and meanings are embedded in context. As mentioned earlier, conflict is inevitable, but it is something to be negotiated by human beings who tend to reflect on their culture while doing so. In an individualistic culture, people maintain their face in order to preserve their own face, while in a collectivistic culture, the person maintains their face for the sake of society. The following are 5 types of conflict styles. First is domination, an individualistic approach to make decisions by dominating or controlling. Second is avoiding, which is a collectivistic approach of staying away from the conflict. Third is obliging, a collectivistic approach of giving up. Fourth is compromising, an individualistic approach to negotiate to come to a solution. And lastly is integrating, which is an individualistic approach to work together to reach a solution.
The story, Fall of the House of Usher. The Fall of the House of Usher is a supernatural horror story summarizing a Gothic theme with its characters and plot. Edgar Allan Poe, the author, published the said tale in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in 1839 and issued in Poe's Tales of Grotesque and Arabesque in 1840. At a time when most popular literature was highly moralistic, Poe's stories were concerned only with creating emotional effects. Poe charged that most of his contemporaries were didactic. That is, they were preoccupied with making religious or political statements in their writings, to the detriment of the fiction itself. His own tales of terror, in which he often depicted the psychological disintegration of unstable or emotionally overwrought characters, were in sharp contrast to the works of more highly praised writer of that time. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the most important and influential American writers of the 19th century. He was the first author to try to make a professional living as a writer. He is known for his poems and short stories with a modern detective and gothic flair. In 1811, when Poe's mother died, he was taken under the care of his godfather. Poe attended university and fell into a gambling problem, which led him to stop university. Poverty then forced Poe into joining the U.S. Military Academy, to which he got expelled from being absent from all his drills. He then proceeded to New York City and wrote poems, returned to Baltimore and wrote short stories, and by 1835 he was the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. There he made a name as a critical reviewer, but was then fired for drinking in his job. Edgar Allan Poe had his share of losses and unfortunate events, which led him to write in a similar theme. Poe completely transformed the genre of the horror story with his masterful tales of psychological depth and insight not envisioned in the genre before his time, and scarcely seen it in since. Stories like The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of the Red Death, and The Fall of the House of Usher reveal Poe's talent at its height.
On a dull, gloomy, and soundless day, an unnamed narrator approaches a dark and strange mansion which belonged to his friend Roderick Usher. The home seemed to have absorbed an unpleasant and sickly aura from the rotting trees and filthy ponds around it. He's come to the home since his friend Roderick wrote him a letter pleading for his presence. He observed that though the house is deteriorating in certain areas, the building itself is rather intact. Roderick wrote that he was feeling physically and emotionally ill, so the narrator is rushing to his assistance. The narrator finds the inside of the home is equally as creepy as the outside. He makes his way through the lengthy corridors to Roderick's waiting area. Roderick seems paler and less likely than he used to be, he observes. Roderick admits that he is nervous and afraid, and that his senses are heightened. Despite being an ancient clan, the Usher family has never prospered. Only one Usher family member has lived from generation to generation, resulting in a direct line of ancestry with no outside branches. Roderick appears to be scared of his own home, according to the narrator. Madeline, Roderick's sister, has become ill with an unknown illness, possibly catalepsy, the loss of limb control that the doctors are unable to cure. Roderick is depressed and the narrator spends many days attempting to cheer him up. He listens to Roderick play the guitar and make up songs, and he reads him stories, but he is unable to boost Roderick's spirits. Roderick soon proposes the idea that the home is unhealthy, exactly as the narrator speculated at the start of the story. Madeline soon dies and Roderick decides to bury her temporarily in the graves underneath the house because he fears that the doctor will dig up her body for scientific research since her condition was so strange to them. Roderick feels more uneasy over the next few days, while the narrator is unable to sleep one night as well. Roderick appears to be agitated when he bangs on his door. To pass the time, the narrator chooses to read to Roderick. He hears noises that correlate to the descriptions in the novel as he reads. He dismisses the sounds at first as the whims of his imagination. However, the sounds become more distinct over time, and he can no longer ignore them. Roderick has fallen over in his chair and is muttering to himself that he has been hearing these sounds for days, and fears that Madeline has been burned alive and is attempting to flee. Suddenly, he yells from behind the door that she is standing there. Madeline stands in white robes bloodied from her struggle as the wind blasts open the door. She falls on Roderick as her life ebbs out, and he succumbs to fear. The narrator runs away from the house. As he flees, the entire home fractures and crumbles to the ground along the breach in the frame.
Here's are the characters. First is the narrator. He's the unnamed in the story. Roderick, childhood and friend. Narrator come to visit Roderick in order to cheer him up, restore his health. Fearful of his imaginary and real experience in the house of Usher. And he is the only surviving witness to the events of the story. Second is Roderick Usher. He is the friend of the narrator, a wealthy gentleman living in his family's long-head estate. His features include sickly pale skin, matte hair, and that has been allowed to grow wildly, and eyes that are large and luminous. He is also a hypochondriac who is going insane from fear and isolation. He is also intelligent and bookish, and able to distinguish fantasy from reality. Has a speech of impediment during his childhood, worsened as he grew overly sensitive to noise and other stimuli. And the last is Madeline Asher, the Roderick twin sister. She suffers from an unknown disease that doctors cannot cure. She is cataleptic, characterized by muscular rigidity and fixity of posture regardless of external stimuli, as well as decreased sensitivity to pain. She buried alive. At some points, a paranormal figure stuck somewhere between death and life. Elusive and deeply disturbed characters whose presence always felt but very rarely seen.
In the conclusion part, the group will be integrating the theory to the story and cite their conclusion as a whole. For the integration of the face negotiation theory to the story, considering the imagery and description presented in the story, it can be assumed that the story happened in Europe, specifically in the United Kingdom, as the title of house is only given to those families who are rich and influential. Since the House of Usher pertains to both the building itself and the family, and according to the narrator's description of the house building when he was there, it can be inferred that the House of Usher is rich. The story was published in September 1839, so the time context of the story must be around the 19th century or earlier, since the mode of transportation used by the unnamed narrator in the story is a horse. One of the generalizations of the face negotiation theory is that people in Western countries are more individualistic in reacting to conflicts, and they belong in the low context culture. They try to protect themselves and dominate or compete in times of trouble, and can even be aggressive and progress oriented in conflicting situations. This individualistic approach can be clearly seen in the characters of the story. However, a collectivist approach was also portrayed in the story.
First, we have is Roderick Usher. Roderick Asher was the one who urged his friend, the narrator, to visit his house in order to alleviate his malady. He was educated and an intellectual, especially coming from his background, it is to be expected. But even with that, he was still consumed by sorrow because of Madeline's illness, his illness, and the mental condition brought about by the House of Usher. Roderick shows an individualist perspective when he decided to live in seclusion. Together with his twin sister, he lived in their family's long-lived estate, the House of Usher. Until despite his standing in the society, he has no friends except for the narrator, who he considered as his closest friend. And for this reason, his secluded life led to him having no social life, consumed by sorrow and illness, and growing mad. Roderick displayed conditions the same as the house. He looked neglected, as he looked pale and sickly because he had a hard time focusing in personal care and his possessions, which is not a socially acceptable behavior. And at the end of the story, Roderick finally lost it and met his fate. He became the last of his lineage, leading to the crumbling and fall of the House of Usher, which shows how Roderick and the house are tied. And lastly, Roderick also portrayed a collectivist perspective. He turned to his friend, who he hasn't seen for a long time, for support during his difficult times, which is a trait of a collectivist. This was the only way he knew to resolve and save face in this conflict, as he was on the verge of a physical and psychic breakdown.
The narrator. All throughout the story, the narrator mentioned little about himself. Unlike Roderick's life, he made no mention of his background, his own family life, not even his name. Despite the mystery behind the narrator, we determined that he and Roderick were childhood friends. He was the sole witness of what had transpired in the House of Usher. The narrator portrays a collectivist perspective. At the beginning of the story, the narrator has shown concern towards his friend, Roderick Usher, through visiting his house when he received his friend's letter seeking for his company. Despite the distance and how long it has been since they last saw each other, the narrator went out of his way to visit Roderick. From the moment he set foot in the House of Usher, up to how he took care of Roderick as his condition worsened, he showed his empathy. On the other hand, the narrator also showed his individualistic side. At the latter part of the story where the House of Usher has crumbled, instead of crying out for help or worry about his friend, he left as if nothing happened.
Next is Madeline Usher. Madeline is also sick in the story, just like her brother. In the story, she wanders around the house, having no contact with anyone, and she does not seem to notice her surroundings. The narrator even said that it's as if she was a ghost. Madeline, for the better part of the narrative, only exists as a shadowy, unnatural figure on the fringes of the story. It is not until she has passed away that she becomes truly noticed, with her finding through resurrection the chance to gain control and a strong position within the narrative. The lady portrays an individualistic perspective. Although she may not be affecting the plot in the earlier part of the story, her return from the dead can be considered as a form of domination, an individualistic approach to make decisions or by controlling. Despite her resurrected form's transience, she uses the opportunity to hold power over her brother by bringing him into death with her, and hold power over the home that they shared, causing its collapse. It is this sense that she has obtained a sort of power through her resurrection that truly frightens Roderick and gives Madeline ultimate control over him.
As to the story, The Fall of House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, it has all the elements of a quintessential Gothic tale, from a haunted house, a pair of strange siblings, to a naive narrator who enters the scene only to be terrorized. Poe's use of subtly creepy descriptions and allusions to hereditary madness continues throughout the story. Some would describe the story as an extended psychological parable in which reality and fantasy, truth and madness, are at odds until the characters and the House of Usher completely falls apart. As one of Poe's most popular and critically examined stories, the short story can be viewed in different ways. hence having different interpretations. One way of understanding and delving deeper to the story is to integrate it to the face negotiation theory. First, Roderick Usher portrays both perspectives. He is individualistic in terms of choosing to live in seclusion and his actions in dealing with his sensitive senses, while collectivist in terms of seeking a help from a friend and not doing anything in spite of hearing sounds after the death of his twin sister. Next, Madeline Usher, who portrays an individualistic perspective that is evident from her resurrection up to bringing his twin brother into death with her through fear. Lastly, the unnamed narrator, who also portrayed both perspectives. His collectivist perspective is shown through visiting the house per his friend's request, and doing his best to cheer up and take care of Roderick. His individualistic side showed up when he decided to run from the house as it crumbled at the end of the story. We cannot absolutely say that the story portrays an individualistic approach or perspective alone, since the setting of the story or even the author is from a Western country. We have to take note that the culture is very dynamic and diverse. There can be instances wherein an individual has a collectivist perspective even though he or she belongs to the Western countries and vice versa, just like portrayed in the short story. Thus, the generalization that Western countries, low context culture, will show an individualistic perspective, and Eastern countries, high context culture, will show a collectivist perspective may not always be true. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.